They called me stupid for walking into court alone, representing myself in my own divorce case to face off against Hollister, the most dangerous divorce lawyer in Detroit. My husband laughed loudly. He said, "My wife is too poor to hire a lawyer." Everyone agreed. Even Judge Thompson looked at me for exactly 1 second, and that look was easy to read. A powerless woman, no lawyer, about to be crushed by the monster in the courtroom. Hollister. I stood up and began to speak. Right after my first sentence, the entire courtroom fell silent. Even the judge stood upright, mouth wide open in shock. But before I tell you my full story, please hit the like button and comment below the city you're living in. I'll start right now. My name is Gianna Baskin. That morning in Detroit was as cold as shattered glass, the wind lashing my face as I stepped out of the old sedan in front of the Wayne County Courthouse. I clutched a file nearly 3 inches thick, something everyone here assumed was just a stack of random papers belonging to a 34-year-old housewife. My husband, Christian, founder of the hedge fund Weather Fund, leaned against the metal railing, arms crossed, wearing that familiar half-smile he always used to remind me I stood a rung beneath him. "She can't afford a lawyer," he declared, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "She's representing herself." A few people chuckled. Hollister, Detroit's top divorce lawyer, known for his cold precision and his undefeated record in tough cases, adjusted his silver gray tie and tilted his head at me as though I had walked into the wrong courthouse. "If you need free legal aid," he said with a smile, "Detroit has a few charities, though I doubt even they could help you." I simply took a deep breath. I was used to being underestimated. They looked at me and saw a housewife with no grasp of the law, a woman who worked part-time at an animal shelter, a docile wife they believed could be crushed in a single hearing. Behind me, Serenity, my husband's mistress, took advantage of the moment before the judge entered to lean down, fix her makeup, and snap a perfectly angled selfie, trying to catch the best light. She posted it straight to her Instagram story, waiting for his victory. She had no idea that within just a few dozen minutes, his would be the most defeated face in the courtroom. As I sat down at the defendant's table, Judge Thompson looked at me for exactly 1 second, and his expression was easy to read. A powerless woman, no lawyer, about to be destroyed by Hollister. He turned and asked, "Mrs. Gianna, you're representing yourself?" I stood up, placed my hand on the file I had spent months preparing, and said simply, "Yes, Your Honor." Christian laughed. Serenity lowered her head to her phone, probably trying to record something for TikTok. Hollister folded his arms, the calm look of someone who thought he was about to win far too easily. But as I opened the file and laid out each document, each one precisely organized without a millimeter out of place, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. I took a deep breath before looking directly at Judge Thompson, my hand resting gently on the corner of the file, and began speaking in a low, steady voice. "Before I present the main parts of the case, I want to begin with a story about my mother." Christian curled his lips slightly, unsure of where I was going. Hollister, used to opening strategies built on sharp arguments or direct evidence, frowned, visibly annoyed by what seemed to him like an emotional detour. But I looked at them both and continued, slower and clearer. My mother was Allison Baskin, the legendary civil and divorce attorney of the state of Michigan. She won over 100 of the largest divorce cases this court system has ever seen. The moment the words left my mouth, Judge Thompson jolted upright. He shifted in his seat, set his pen down, as if he had just heard a name he never expected to echo in this room. "Baskin," he repeated, leaning forward slightly. "You mean Allison Baskin? Mrs. Baskin who used to argue in this district's Supreme Court?" I only nodded. A small nod, but enough to change the air. A few spectators turned to one another. Serenity, who had been silently scrolling Instagram, suddenly looked up, eyes wide in surprise. Christian blinked repeatedly, as though that name had just dropped a piece of forgotten memory right in front of him, something I had never mentioned. And Hollister? His face froze. Even as the best divorce lawyer in Detroit, he knew exactly who Allison Baskin was. In legal circles, that name wasn't just a reputation. It was a force, an era. Some of the strategies Hollister used today were first pioneered by her. I let them sit with that for a few seconds. Then I continued, my voice unwavering. My mother brought home law books, case files, court rulings nearly every night. She analyzed every tiny detail, from financial fraud behavior to psychological tactics used in court. I grew up surrounded by those files. I read them all, before I turned 12. I looked down at my hand, gripping the edge of a document as if I were touching a distant memory of a family long gone. When my mother passed away, there were still 7 boxes of files from her past victories in our home. I went through every interrogation video, every transcript, every handwritten note in red ink. I didn't just read legal theory, I read how she fought. The courtroom was so silent, I could hear the typing from a court clerk in the corner. Finally, I raised my head and looked directly at Hollister, whose face was nearly expressionless. "And that," I said, "is why I don't have legal representation today." I exhaled lightly and delivered the line I knew would strike the deepest chord. Because the best lawyer I've ever known trained me from the time I was a child. I knew that moment was the pivot point to lead them into the most crucial part, what I had done in the 9 months leading up to the divorce. "I want to explain," I continued, my voice steady and even, "why I stand here today with a file detailed down to the minute." I opened the first page of the file, gently turned it toward Judge Thompson so he could see the timeline running dozens of lines long. It all began 9 months ago. Christian swallowed. He knew this wasn't the emotional rambling of a betrayed wife. This was the prelude of someone trained to detect signals. "My husband started changing small habits," I said. "Habits that, had my mother been alive, she would have known were the first signs of someone hiding something." I counted on my fingers, not rushing. "First, the phone." I looked directly at Christian. He took his phone everywhere, into the kitchen, while checking the mail outside, even into the shower, when for 8 years he'd always left it on the living room table. A few people in the audience nodded, as if they'd lived something similar. "Second," I said, were the urgent meetings that always happened right at dinner time. No names, no schedule, no warning, and never a reasonable explanation. Christian opened his mouth, ready to object, but Hollister placed a hand on his shoulder and subtly shook his head. He understood his opponent wasn't an emotional woman, she was an unlocked database. Third, I flipped to another page, was the unfamiliar perfume on his gym shirt, a scent unlike anything ever present in our house during our 9 years together. I didn't need to look at Serenity to know she was shrinking back behind the seats. "I didn't get angry," I continued. "I didn't confront him or start a fight, because my mother once told me, when you don't yet know what you're up against, make no noise." I placed my hand on the file, my voice dropping. "So, I started gathering data. I explained it like presenting a case study. I downloaded every bank statement. I extracted images from the garden camera. I checked the metadata on every photo on his phone, timestamp, GPS location, file size. I saved emails he forgot to close on his laptop. I scanned contracts, invoices, messages, even images of his car being located at places where he said he was working. I displayed a page from the file, a timeline so detailed it looked like the work of a professional investigator. Everything, tracked by day, hour, even minute, from last April until 3 days before I filed for divorce. Hollister leaned toward Christian, whispering something small. Maybe, for the first time in his career, he had to admit, the woman before him was not the naive housewife they had assumed. I tapped the top of the timeline. And everything I found started with these tiny changes. I tracked them for 9 months, without a single person in my house noticing. I looked straight at Christian. But today, it will all be revealed. And as I said it, I felt the entire courtroom, judge, clerk, and every observer, lean slightly toward me, as though preparing to descend into a deeper layer of a story no one expected a housewife could deliver at this level. I took a deep breath and turned the next page of the file, the page I knew would tear off half the mask Christian had worn for the past 9 months. "Your Honor," I said, voice calm to the point of cold. "I'd like to present the first piece of evidence related to my husband's infidelity." Christian straightened like he'd been shocked. Serenity held her breath. Hollister tilted his head, his eyes narrowing with a level of caution he hadn't shown until now. I laid a clearly printed sheet on the wooden stand. A screenshot of an email with full headers, timestamp, sender, and recipient IP addresses. "This is an email from Mr. Hollister's client," I said, "sent to Ms. Serenity Carter on September 17th at 11:42 p.m. I read out the first line clearly. "Don't worry about my wife. She's too naive." No one spoke. That moment, it felt like someone had dropped a stone into the center of the courtroom. Serenity's face froze immediately. But what drew more attention than her reaction was the sudden light from a phone screen peeking out of her purse. A notification lit up on Instagram. "Your story is being viewed by 127 people. Story posted 4 minutes ago." Judge Thompson noticed the light, frowned briefly, then turned back to the evidence I presented. Everyone in the room now understood one thing very clearly. This girl was unprepared for the battle that was actually unfolding. I went on, giving no one time to recover. "Your Honor, I'd like to present the GPS data of the Lexus RX my husband drives. This data comes from the vehicle's telematics system, complete with manufacturer authentication." I activated the courtroom screen. A map of Detroit appeared, with 34 red dots. "Mr. Hollister's client," I said, "was at Ms. Serenity's apartment 34 times over the span of 2 months. Precisely, 34 times. Not during work hours, not on business trips. Mostly between 9 p.m. and 2 a.m. Christian exhaled. A sound like someone had punched him in the chest. Hollister stepped forward, trying to regain control. "Your Honor, we object. These data sources are unclear. They can't—" Judge Thompson raised a hand, cutting him off. "Mr. Hollister, she submitted the chain of custody documentation at the beginning of the session. The GPS has timestamps, metadata, and manufacturer verification. There's no basis to dismiss it." Hollister stood still, lips tight, like a student docked points in front of the class. I looked at Christian. His face was glistening with sweat, eyes darting as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. "Your Honor," I said, my voice lowering, but turning razor sharp. "This is just the first part of what I've gathered. And all of it leads to one conclusion. My husband has been lying for the past 9 months." Christian was beginning to truly gasp for breath, and in that moment, I knew it was time to move to the heaviest blow, the one that wouldn't just shatter the moral image he clung to, but might very well draw the attention of criminal justice. "However," I said, voice calm and measured, "infidelity is just the surface. The most important part of this divorce lies with Weatherfund." Hollister's expression shifted instantly. He had just lost a small round, but now he sensed a larger one approaching. A round he wasn't sure his client could survive. I turned to the financial section of the file, marked by a red tab. "I'd like to present an analysis of Weatherfund's financial reports from the past 2 years." I held up a sheet printed with a bold line Christian once proudly showed me when we were still happy. "Cumulative profit, 2,500%. The courtroom instantly buzzed with murmurs, a figure far too absurd for a small-scale private fund based in Detroit. "Let me emphasize," I continued, 2,500% is not annual growth. It's not quarterly. It's the figure the company claims since inception to January this year." I placed beside it another sheet, one I had analyzed myself. "This," I said, "is the actual profit I calculated from internal ledgers and transaction data. 2%. 2%. Even lower than most savings accounts today." Christian raised a trembling hand to his face, but it barely brushed the air. "So where did the 2,500% come from?" Judge Thompson asked, his voice still calm, but now tinged with real concern. I opened my laptop, projecting a diagram I had drawn over 3 sleepless nights. A circular chart with red arrows looping from investor new to investor old. "Your Honor," I said, "Weatherfund is operating a Ponzi scheme. They use funds from new investors to pay out fake profits to older ones and cover it up using fabricated audit reports." Hollister rushed to Christian's table, leaning down as if trying to silence a bomb before it detonated. I pressed on, letting nothing interrupt the rhythm. In 2024, Christian and his associates raised $39 million from over 100 individuals. Nearly half were elderly, including people who emptied their retirement accounts believing in a promise of wealth. A woman in the gallery raised her hand to her mouth, whispering, "Oh my God!" The air in the courtroom thickened, as if every molecule had stopped moving. I turned my laptop screen toward the judge. I cross-referenced actual balances, outgoing transactions, and what Weatherfund claimed as investments. The discrepancies are enormous and unexplainable by any legitimate operation. I paused, exactly one beat, then delivered the line that could break Serenity. "And this is where the Mistress comes in." Serenity instantly looked up. I pointed to an expense line. Fund money was used for trips to Hawaii, Dubai, Las Vegas, and multiple hotel charges where Mr. Hollister's client met privately with Ms. Serenity Carter. Serenity went pale. Her mouth let out a whisper before she could stop it. "You said it was your money." That line, soft, trembling, rang through the courtroom like an unintended confession. Christian whipped his head toward her, panic flashing in his eyes. The entire room stirred with noise, while Judge Thompson sat upright, his gaze shifting from suspicion to assessment, then into true legal alertness. I closed the laptop gently. "Your Honor," I said, "infidelity didn't destroy this marriage, but financial fraud has destroyed hundreds of other lives." I didn't let anyone react. I opened another section of the file marked with an orange tab, the color my mother used to flag materials with potential criminal implications. "Your Honor," I said, "I'd like to present further evidence of illegal personal expenditures made from the Weatherfund account." I placed on the table a series of printed invoices from 5-star hotels. Waldorf Astoria Dubai, Four Seasons Oahu, Ritz-Carlton Maui. All of these charges, I said, were paid using investor money. Christian shut his eyes tightly. Serenity lowered her head, like she wanted to disappear into the wooden floor. I went on. "And here is footage from the Honolulu airport, with verified timestamp." I enlarged the image on screen. Christian pulling a suitcase alongside Serenity, walking out of the international gate, his arm wrapped around her waist, with the date and time clearly displayed. Hollister shot up. "Your Honor, we—" But I cut in, gently but sharply. "Mr. Hollister, what's next is more important. Please allow me to continue." I opened the second file, dark red tab. "This," I said, "is a message exchange between Christian and Dr. J.T. Morgan, a physician he knows personally." I projected the messages on screen. Simple lines, but enough to shake anyone. Christian: "She's asking to withdraw $220,000. I need you to write me a diagnosis. Something that would put her under transaction restrictions." Dr. Morgan: "How much?" Christian: $10,000. "I'll transfer as soon as you send the paper." No one breathed. No one moved. No one picked up a pen, because every pen had already fallen from hand. Serenity covered her mouth, gasping. A man in the back shook his head and whispered, "God, this isn't even about divorce anymore." I turned to the judge, voice low. "Your Honor, this is no longer just a marital dispute. This is fraud, bribery, and unlawful medical manipulation, targeted at a 62-year-old female investor who was desperate to withdraw her money to pay for her husband's treatment." Judge Thompson's face visibly darkened. He placed both hands on the bench, fingers interlaced, his eyes far more serious now. "Mrs. Gianna," he said slowly, "the court needs a few minutes to review these documents." But Hollister rose first, his voice trembling, a tone I was certain he had never used in any courtroom in Detroit. "Your Honor, I request 10 minutes to confer with my client." In that exact second, for the first time all morning, Hollister, the best divorce lawyer in Detroit, looked like a man being strangled by the very truth his client had tried to bury. Judge Thompson nodded, tapping the gavel lightly. "Court is in recess." Christian buried his head in his hands as the judge called for a recess, but I didn't get up right away. I knew the next part wasn't meant to destroy anyone. It was to explain why I, a woman once seen as fragile, was able to stand this strong. Judge Thompson continued scanning a few pages, even though the hearing was paused. When he finally looked up, his gaze was filled with questions, not about the evidence anymore, but about the person presenting it. I placed my hand on the file, drew a deep breath, then spoke softly but clearly enough for everyone to hear. Your Honor, I'd like to explain why I've been able to face all of this alone. Hollister, leaning over to whisper to Christian, instinctively paused. Serenity looked up, her eyes still wide with shock. I turned a page, not financial records, not emails, not GPS logs, but an old photograph, its corners slightly curled with time. After my parents died in an accident, I began slowly, I went to live with my grandmother. I was only 14. A few people in the gallery sighed quietly. I continued, my voice softer now, but no less steady. My grandmother didn't have much money, but she had something I've never seen in any other adult, complete calm in the face of crisis. She used to tell me, whenever I cried, missing my mother, Jana, you have to stand on your own. No one's coming to save you, but you can save yourself. I paused, as if seeing the old kitchen in Grand Rapids, where she used to slice apples for me every evening. From her, I learned how to breathe when fear makes you want to run. I learned how to stay still when the world tries to knock you over. I learned that real strength isn't shouting louder, it's knowing when to stay quiet, to observe, to prepare. I looked toward Christian. He didn't dare meet my eyes. I'm not here for revenge, I said, my voice firmer, deeper. I'm just protecting myself, the way my grandmother taught me to. The courtroom was silent. But this silence was different, not one of tension or unease, but one of respect. Judge Thompson set down his pen, leaning slightly forward. His eyes, for the first time this long morning, no longer saw me as a powerless woman representing herself. He looked at me as an equal, someone who knew exactly what she was doing and why she had to do it. Mrs. Gianna, he said slowly, the court acknowledges that. Judge Thompson acknowledged my words, and in that brief moment, I felt as if my grandmother's presence was standing just behind me, her warm hand on my shoulder, like she always did when I made it through a storm. I gently gripped the edge of the file and introduced the next part, something that might seem small to many, but for me, it was one of the reasons I was still standing today. Your Honor, I said, I'd like to speak about my part-time work at the Detroit Animal Shelter. Christian let out a bitter laugh, the kind that had silenced me for years. Shelter? She's bringing dog poop into court now? He muttered, loud enough for a few to hear. I didn't respond. Instead, I took out a small light blue USB, the color the shelter used for internal files. I used to believe that loyalty was the one thing you couldn't buy, I said, but it turns out I lived with a man who didn't understand its value. I plugged in the USB and played a short video, barely 10 seconds long, filmed by a volunteer during a fundraising event for animal rescue that Christian had reluctantly attended 2 years ago. The screen lit up. Christian's voice rang out, sharp and unapologetic. I hate dogs! What if fur gets on my $5,000 suit? The entire courtroom let out a collective, oh, followed by a few scattered laughs, not because it was funny, but because his pettiness was so absurdly clear. Serenity covered her face with her sleeve, like she wanted to vanish. Hollister sat upright, for the first time all morning, looking like he regretted ever taking this case. I paused the video right as Christian shook his sleeve like it had been insulted by dust. I've watched this clip dozens of times, I said, my voice low, and each time, I asked myself, why am I with someone who disrespects the things I love most? I looked directly at Christian, for the first time, unafraid of his gaze. At the shelter, I continued, the abandoned animals still licked my hand even when I had nothing to offer. I wasn't rich, I wasn't remarkable, I had nothing but open arms and a little kindness. I learned from them that loyalty is something you give, not something you demand. In the gallery, an older woman gently nodded, gripping her purse tightly. Perhaps she too had once been dismissed for her softness. I smiled faintly, for the first time during the trial. And now, I said, closing the USB, I can have dogs if I want to. I no longer have to ask anyone whether a living creature deserves to exist in my home. A quiet warmth passed through the courtroom, a rare moment of peace in a morning otherwise burdened with weight. Hollister was still eyeing me thoughtfully after I finished my story about the shelter, but I knew that tender moment wouldn't last. A courtroom isn't a place for sharing kindness. It's where the truth must be exposed to its bitter end. I returned to my table and opened the next section of the file. Christian looked at me as if to say, "Stop," but we had gone too far to turn back. "Your Honor," I said, voice calm again but sharp as a blade, "I request to proceed with cross-examination." The air in the courtroom instantly tightened. I turned, locking eyes with Christian, the man I once believed to be my pillar. "Christian," I began, "can you explain the Q2 profit report from last year? Specifically, the return allocation, Tier B item?" Christian swallowed hard. The growth from the real estate portfolio," he stammered. I shook my head. "Incorrect. That was a fake allocation used to cover up new investor funds." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. I continued. "Second question. What was the fund's actual total assets as of December 31st? Christian closed his eyes and guessed, "About 18 million? "Wrong," I replied instantly. 3.4 million. The rest was in transit funds, which, in reality, didn't exist. Someone behind me whispered, "Oh, God." Third question. Can you explain the role of Harper Consulting LLC, the firm you listed as your independent auditor? "Oh, of course," Christian said, trying to regain composure. "They audit—" I cut him off, laying down a sheet of paper. "Harper Consulting is a shell company. The address exists on paper, but has no office, no employees, just a rented mailbox." Christian was speechless. Hollister rubbed his forehead, letting out a long sigh. I paused, looking the judge in the eye, signaling there was still more. "Fourth question," I said. "In this contract," I held up a thick document bearing his signature. "You stated that the fund never used investor money for personal expenses. Do you remember that?" Christian mumbled. I didn't sign that." That line was the moment the entire courtroom stopped breathing. I calmly placed the original document on the table and flipped to the signature page. "This is your signature," I said. "May 12th, 2024. Verified by a notary public." Christian looked like he had lost all gravity. Judge Thompson turned to Hollister. "Mr. Hollister, do you object to this line of questioning?" Hollister opened his mouth, but no words came out. Eventually, he just shook his head. The judge turned back to me. "Very well. Proceed." That sentence rang out like a second gavel strike, but this time, it opened a path for me, a housewife, to face my husband and Detroit's best divorce lawyer head-on. I looked at Christian. A single bead of sweat rolled down the bridge of his nose. Slow, long, heavy like the comma at the end of a story he no longer controlled. And I remained standing, steady, carrying the rhythm of someone who knew they were about to place the final exclamation mark on a long chapter of deception. "Your Honor," I said, "I would now like to present the most critical document, the forensic flow map of Weather Fund." I opened the last folder, marked with a black tab, the color my mother always used for the finishing blow. The large courtroom screen lit up, not words, not spreadsheets, but a complex forensic diagram, green, red, and yellow arrows connecting like the circulatory system of a vast organism. I pointed to the first node. This is the investor account. I pointed to the second, where a red arrow twisted through the chart. This is the Weather Fund intermediary account. Then I placed my finger on a red dot off to the side, in the far right corner of the map. Circled in red, something I had added at 2 a.m., the night before I filed for divorce. "And this," I emphasized, "is Christian Miller's personal account. The money goes straight here." A sound spread across the courtroom, a rustle like wind through trees. Christian jumped to his feet, snarling, She's just a housewife. She doesn't know how to read forensic documents. I looked at him calmly, not with anger, but the composure of someone who understands that truth speaks louder than shouting. I do know how to read, I said, each word dropping like a stone into still water. Because a housewife who can read forensic flow maps is no longer just a housewife. Behind me, someone let out a long, low, "Oh!" echoing and spreading like dominoes through the courtroom. Not a sound of mockery, but of recognition, of shock, of a moment when everyone realized who in this room truly knew what they were doing. Judge Thompson set down his pen, wrote a few lines, then read aloud. Court record. Based on the evidence presented, the likelihood of financial fraud is high. This court refers the case to the Attorney General's office and the SEC for formal investigation. A new silence settled over the courtroom. The silence of the law entering the room. Christian collapsed into his chair, face ashen, as though all the blood had drained from his body. Hollister, for the first time in his legendary career, sat frozen like a statue, out of words and out of options. As for me, standing in the center of the courtroom, I felt as if my feet were finally touching the ground after months of floating in fear. Judge Thompson set down his pen, removed his glasses, and looked at me for a long time, a look I hadn't seen from him all morning. Not pity, not doubt, but complete respect for someone who stood up for the truth. He cleared his throat and read each word clearly. Based on the evidence presented in this morning's proceedings, the court finds that Christian Miller used marital assets for illegal and personal purposes. This constitutes marital waste. Christian looked up, eyes glassy, unable to believe those 3 words could demolish all the leverage he thought he had. Therefore, the judge continued, the court orders the following division of assets. Mrs. Gianna Miller shall receive 70% of all jointly owned marital assets. Someone in the gallery let out a quiet exhale. A near whispered, "She deserves it," quickly silenced out of courtroom decorum. I gave a small nod. Not in celebration, but in recognition that justice was finally realigning to the right side. Furthermore, the judge added, tone growing firmer, Mr. Christian Miller shall reimburse all funds spent on his mistress, Serenity Carter, which were drawn from marital finances. The court will require detailed account statements for reconciliation. Christian exhaled sharply, not in anger, but in dread. Hollister placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to steady his client, but even that hand trembled slightly. And for a lawyer like Hollister, trembling meant he understood this case had gone far beyond divorce. The judge flipped to the final page of his notes. Regarding Weather Fund, based on the forensic map, bribery texts, unlawful expenditures, and falsified financial reporting, the court officially refers all materials for criminal investigation to the following agencies. He spoke each name like a hammer striking the spine of Christian. SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission. AG, Attorney General's Office, Fraud Investigation Unit of the State of Michigan. With each name, Christian's body slumped further. By the third, he gripped the edge of the table to keep himself from collapsing forward. His face had turned pale, his eyes hollowed. His chest heaved like a man trying to breathe in a room with no air. He was no longer a man getting divorced. He was a man realizing he stood at the edge of criminal prosecution. The judge closed his file. This session is temporarily adjourned. The court will reconvene next week. The sound of the gavel hitting the bench echoed like the lid closing on the coffin of Christian's former life. I walked out of the courtroom without looking back, and I didn't need to. Because the moment that heavy wooden door shut behind me, I knew a chapter had closed. A chapter filled with wounds and betrayal. But the most painful part of any chapter is never when it ends. It's when you have to begin a new one completely alone. The Detroit afternoon was windswept and cold. I returned to the 3-bedroom house that once was our home. But the moment I opened the door, I realized it was no longer a home. It was just a space that held the objects I had tried to preserve in a desperate attempt to hold on to a marriage that had long since died. I stood in the living room, looking at the wedding photos, the stacks of ceramic mugs he liked, the cold suits still hanging in the closet, then turned away, I didn't need any of it. I didn't need anything that belonged to him. I gathered only 3 things: the wool scarf my mother knitted when I was 10, my grandmother's journal, and a small photo frame of my mother, attorney Allison Baskin, which I had never found the courage to hang on the wall in that house. I placed them into a small box, light enough to cradle in my arms, a lifetime's worth of memories, now compact enough to hold. Then I walked out of that house and closed the door behind me without a second glance. Late-day Detroit glowed in the pale yellow of spring sunlight, a light that made everything look slightly retouched. Brighter, clearer. I rented a small apartment near Eastern Market, just 500 square feet, with windows that looked out over the flower stalls and the colorful graffiti walls. The place was so small, I could touch all 3 walls with just a few steps. And yet, strangely, I could breathe easier than in any spacious house I had ever lived in. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. For the first time in years, every decision in my life didn't require anyone's permission. That evening, I went to the Midtown Rescue Shelter to finalize adoption for a retired K-9 who once served a late veteran. The shelter manager placed a hand on its back and said, "This one's so loyal, all it needs is to believe in one person, and it'll believe for life." I knelt and looked into its deep brown eyes, the eyes of a warrior too tired to keep fighting, yet still willing to be loyal one more time. "We both need a fresh start, don't we?" I whispered. It gently licked my hand. A simple gesture, but it felt like someone had just handed me a reason to believe in kindness again. Back at my new apartment, I opened the small box I had carried, and I did something I had never done in my entire marriage. I hung my mother's photo on the wall. The photo of Allison Baskin, hair neatly tied, eyes sharp as steel but warm as fire, now rested in the heart of the living room. In that tiny, quiet space, the photo seemed brighter than I remembered. I stood there for a long time. I didn't cry. I simply felt something I thought I had lost at 14, the presence of family. I whispered, speaking both to myself and to her, "I'm starting over, this time my way." My new life moved quietly, like early mornings in a misty Detroit. I walked the retired K-9 around Eastern Market every day, taught him to sit, wait, shake paws, then sat by the window, watching the flower stalls open at 6 a.m. I was relearning how to live slowly, something I'd never known during the entire marriage. Then, exactly 3 months after the hearing, just as I was brewing a cup of morning tea, my phone buzzed with a string of notifications. The first alert that caught my eye was from the familiar logo of the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission. Bold black letters scrolled across the screen like a cold blade. SEC freezes weather fund assets. Directors banned from trading. Preliminary charges, misrepresentation, investor fraud, unlawful fund diversion. Assets frozen. All trades halted. Christian and his partners ordered to compensate defrauded investors. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel triumph. I just exhaled quietly. This was the nature of truth. It doesn't need us to fight forever. It stands up on its own. 2 days later, I stepped down to buy coffee from my usual market shop, and the Detroit Free Press was front and center, taking up half the front page. Local fund revealed as Ponzi scheme. Founder under criminal investigation. Just beneath the headline was a photo of Christian stepping out of a federal building, hands covering his face, camera flashes lighting up the corner of the street. I stared at the image a bit longer than I expected. The arrogant man who once smirked at me outside the courthouse now looked like a husk emptied from within. An elderly woman at the newsstand shook her head. He lulled the whole city with promises of wealth. Now everyone's awake. I just nodded. No words, none needed. Serenity vanished from social media as if she'd never existed. Just 3 weeks ago, she'd posted gym videos, flaunted a watch Christian had gifted her, captioned, "Lucky Girl Era." Now, every one of her accounts read, "This user is no longer available." The internet turned on her mercilessly. Some even photoshopped her face onto Ponzi princess posters. She shut everything down, disappeared from Detroit like she'd been swept away by wind. As for Christian, I heard he'd been summoned multiple times to the Attorney General's office. A source, a court clerk I knew, whispered he couldn't stay standing when he heard the words potential felony charges. Weatherfund didn't just collapse, it disintegrated. No employees, no office, no website, just dozens of families trying to reclaim what was stolen. That night, I stood by the apartment window, hand resting on my K9's head as he slept peacefully at my feet. The Detroit city lights reflected off the photo of my mother on the wall. I looked down over the city and understood one thing. Justice had finally outrun pain. In the days following the collapse of Weatherfund, my tiny apartment began to feel warmer. Not from the yellow lights I installed or the new rug I laid down, but because I finally felt like I was living somewhere that belonged to me, not the shadow of someone else. One afternoon, as my K9 lay curled on the wooden floor, my phone rang. Unknown number. The voice on the other end was low, raspy, with the edge of someone who had stood in thousands of courtrooms. "Is this Gianna Miller?" I answered quietly. "Yes, it is." She chuckled, the knowing laugh of someone who's seen too much truth in her lifetime. "This is Evelyn Ross. I used to square off against your mother in court. I watched your hearing that day." I froze. She wasn't just any lawyer. She was a Detroit legend, once dubbed the Iron Widow of Family Court by the press. Her voice slowed, each word carefully chosen. "If you ever want to be a paralegal or an investigator, I'll train you. Even the best attorneys in Detroit couldn't have done what you did in that courtroom." I looked at the photo of my mother on the wall. Allison Baskin, eyes sharp as winter wind, warm as March sun. I imagined how much she would have loved hearing that offer. But strangely, my heart didn't lean toward the courtroom anymore, not out of fear, but because I realized what my mother left me wasn't just the law, it was a voice. "Thank you," I said softly, "but I think there's another path I need to take." There was a long pause on the other end. Finally, she said, "All right then, girl, but use that voice well. The world needs women like you." That evening, I opened my laptop, set a small microphone on the kitchen counter, and sat with my K9 lying faithfully at my feet. I hit record. No script, no prep. I told my story, the first in a podcast series about women who were betrayed by powerful husbands, whether politicians, Hollywood stars, or CEOs, and who, with the help of great lawyers like my mother and their own resilience, fought back and won. I wasn't doing it for revenge. I wasn't doing it to flaunt victory. I was doing it to tell the women sitting in the shadows of their pain that they are not alone. 2 days later, I posted the video to YouTube. It started as a small experiment. But by the weekend, I opened the dashboard and saw a number that stunned even me. 2 million views and 100,000 subscribers. Women from all over the English-speaking world. Strong women who hate betrayal. If you are one of them, I said at the end of the video, please like and subscribe, so I know you're out there too. 2 million people listen to my voice speak of truth, justice, and the courage I once thought I lacked. In the video description, I wrote just one line. For Mom, Allison Baskin. That night, I sat in my small apartment, lit only by the glow against the wall and my mother's softly golden photo. I whispered, "I've used what you gave me to lift up the ones you once fought for." And for the first time since the accident when I was 14, I felt my mother right here, in this tiny room, in every breath I spoke, and in every woman who rose after hearing my story. The K9 lay at my feet, his head resting on my leg like a quiet promise. "I'm here. I'm not leaving." I ran my hand down his back, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his breath, a piece I hadn't touched in years. On the coffee table sat the final file, the one that had followed me from the kitchen to the living room, from the bedroom to the courthouse, from fear to truth. I placed both hands on the cover, took a deep breath, and closed it. This time, not to pause, but to end it completely. The file gave a soft click, quiet, but loud enough to mark that I no longer needed it to go on. I stood, took out my laptop, and opened a new file. The first words I typed, slow and certain. How I Won My Own Divorce. Not a book for revenge, not a book to brag, but a book for every woman who's ever been underestimated, to know they can stand tall on their own, just as I had. I leaned back, looking at the photo of my mother, Allison Baskin, hanging on the wall. The Detroit lights reflected in the glass, making her eyes glow brighter, as if she were smiling at me. I whispered gently, slowly, "Mom, I've lived your legacy." The breeze from the window stirred the photo frame softly. I closed my eyes, and in that moment, I felt as if her hand was resting on my shoulder. Not a memory, but a presence. I opened my eyes, gazed at the skyline stretching beyond, the tall buildings standing like sentinels guarding new beginnings. A natural smile came to my lips. Because at last, I understood. This wasn't the end. This was only the first chapter of the life I chose for myself. If this journey made you stronger, or helped you believe that any woman can rise after heartbreak, then please hit like. If you want to support me as I keep telling stories about truth, justice, and women rising from their own pain, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the next story will speak straight to the hearts of many women out there. It's about a wife who discovers her husband is cheating, not with a stranger, but with her very best friend.